I had just gotten into Muay Thai. I'd been training for about 2 years. It changed the way I moved in the world. Like I've always thought of myself as like a pretty like dominant like personality and like fearless, blah 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 blah. But like there, we all swim in the same sort of sexist waters, and I'd certainly absorbed lots of messages about what it meant to be a woman, and like spending a couple of hours a day hitting things as hard as I could
It's
changed the
amazing.
way that I walked around.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We are the Cape Cod DSA. I am Michael, co-chair of the Cape Cod DSA. Allie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Allie Wilkie, a DSA member and treasurer, technically speaking, on the Cape.
Cape Cod DSA is the largest socialist organization in the area. Our mission is to educate ourselves and those around us in the inherent destructive nature of capitalism and to look to socialism as an alternative while pushing for transformative changes from the local level all the way up to the federal level. Some popular Democratic socialists you may be familiar with are Bernie Sanders, of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, even some less well-known socialists, well, they're super famous, but no one knows them as socialists, are Albert Einstein and Martin Luther King Jr. While the organization as a whole focuses on many different issues, each chapter can choose what they like to work on. So for the Cape Cod DSA, we're currently focusing on 3 different areas. We're collaborating with other DSA chapters across the state to work on a ballot initiative to achieve Medicare for All in Massachusetts. In addition, we are pushing for a green stimulus, which is very much similar to the Green New Deal, but on a state level. And on the local level, we're also pushing for socialized housing. And of course, we're doing this speaker series where we go over policing in society and the many ways in which police and the police state affect us. So today we have special guest, Kaytlin Bailey. She is the Director of Communications for Decriminalize Sex Work, a national advocacy organization. She's also a host of the Oldest Profession podcast and a stand-up comic. In 2013, Kaytlin came out as a sex worker and went on to write about her experiences for multiple publications, including Vice. I've read a couple of the articles today. They're really fascinating, really insightful. I would suggest everyone go and read them. So how this event is set up, Kaytlin will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll take a few questions from Allie. At that point, we'll open up for questions in general. While Kaytlin is speaking, the chat will be disabled to avoid distractions. So please write down any questions you have throughout the talk and put them in the chat once it opens back up. Additionally, any hateful, inappropriate behavior will result in an immediate ban from the event with no opportunity for reentry. So please keep it civil. With
No
that
heckler.
said, Kaytlin, exactly, definitely no hecklers. Take it away.
Great. Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Kaytlin Bailey. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Kaytlin. I am the Director of Communications for Decriminalize Sex Work, which is a national organization, but I am also a sex worker and a member of a criminalized class, which I think has given me a perspective on the police state that we're currently living in, and also alternatives to policing in communities. Sex work communities and other marginalized groups have been turning to each other to find community solutions outside of the carceral system for generations. And so I think that there's a lot of wisdom within sex work communities that can and should be brought into other circles. And I'm thrilled that the DSA is listening to sex workers. And I think that if we work together, we can stop the arrests. So just to give an overview of the way that I'm going to move through this talk, first I want to spend some time breaking down the 4 different models of policing prostitution, just so that we get really clear about what it is that we're talking about. I'm going to go through a brief history of policing prostitution in the United States, and then I'm going to talk about ways that we can use paradigms of policing prostitution to ask for more community support and to work towards y'all's goals of investing in communities instead of carceral solutions. And I think that the way that we treat sex work and prostitution is a great sort of microcosm that the lessons there are applicable to broader issues. For example, at the end of this talk, you will understand how Medicare for All is an anti-trafficking bill, actually, and can be discussed that way, especially since anti-trafficking bills have a tendency to pass legislatures with 95, 98%, even when they hurt communities. But I digress. Let's start with the 4 different models of policing prostitution. So first, there's full criminalization. This is the situation that we're most familiar with in the United States. This means that both buying, selling, and facilitating or promoting prostitution is a crime. Now, what kind of crime that is, whether it's a misdemeanor or a federal crime, depends on lots of external circumstances, but full criminalization essentially means that both sides, or like the full circle of sex work, is criminalized, where both clients and providers are committing a crime. In practice, this tends to mean that mostly the provider or the professional is criminalized. So this is where this is the model that has been used in the U.S. and that, you know, we sort of exported it to the rest of the world along with other colonial powers like Europe. There's a lot there, but that's what full criminalization looks like. Partial criminalization, which you sometimes hear referred to as the Nordic model or end demand. I've also heard it called the entrapment model or the suppression model, is when you only criminalize clients and third parties. Well, actually, sorry, only criminalize clients and third parties. This is the brainchild of Nordic countries. It is presented as a feminist model. This doesn't work in practice. What we see everywhere that the Nordic model or end demand policies are implemented, you see violence against sex workers go up, right? Which is a little bit of a paradox or a contradiction, because these laws are ostensibly designed to help sex workers, but it locks us into a framework of female, or feminized victim or as the seller, and a male predator as the buyer. And this is the framework that legislators and lawmakers bring to, I'm sorry, I only had 1 cup of coffee, and it was a long time ago. Those are the underlying assumptions that of this model. What this means in practice is when you suppress demand or when you criminalize clients, you push the entire industry underground, because at its heart, sex work is a sales job. And so we go to where the clients are. And if you criminalize clients and if you give them more reasons to fear authority, then you reduce the negotiating power of the provider. For example, when I was working as an escort in North Carolina, 2004, 2005, this is before Sesta Fosta, my clients did not fear criminalization, but I did. And so I would ask for references. I needed their full name, where they worked, and before anybody crossed the threshold of my hotel room, I needed to see their ID and hold it in hand. This kind of reference checking is impossible if clients are criminalized, because it's impossible to tell the difference between somebody who is scared and somebody who is scary, right? So if somebody isn't giving me their real name, I don't know if that's because they are a reasonable and rational person that doesn't want to provide evidence for their arrest, or if they're trying to skirt my screening techniques because they're a serial rapist or possibly a serial killer. And so this is a problem for sex workers, which is why every place that you see this model implemented, and violence against sex workers increases. Additionally, all of the Nordic countries, that have implemented this policy give a lot of lip service to providing services for victims, exit services, job training, housing, etc. None of that has ever manifested. Instead, in order to police clients, you end up encouraging law enforcement to continue to surveil and harass sex workers. We're going to get into this in a minute, but it's important when talking about sex work policy to reduce encounters with law enforcement, because law enforcement is actually the #1 source of distress and violence in sex workers' lives across the board. Well, except in New Zealand, and we'll get into that in a second. So we've talked about criminalization, we've talked about partial criminalization or the Nordic model. Let's talk about legalization or regulation. This is what you see in Nevada and also in Amsterdam. What this does is it creates tightly regulated regulation, licensing schemes, mandatory STD tests, anything where sex workers would have to register with the state and subject themselves to a unique set of laws that only apply to sex workers. That's when you're talking about legalization and regulation. And this is something that sex workers hate. Nevada is actually a textbook example of why this model doesn't work. Nevada is the only state in the union with legal, regulated prostitution, and it has the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution in the country. Why is that? Well, having the legally licensed brothels creates a perverse incentive to crack down even harder on the black market of sex work, which very much still exists. Only a small minority of sex workers are willing and able to register with the local sheriff as a licensed prostitute, get hired by and work in one of the predominantly male-owned brothels with its own set of rules and regulations, all of which limit the freedom of movement and freedom of expression of the sex workers that work there. In order to be hired, you mostly have to be a cis, able-bodied, usually white, classically beautiful, or traditionally beautiful person, and you have to be willing to give the house half of your money and register with the state. This becomes a thing about you that is used in whorephobic contexts in other ways. For example, somebody that chooses to work as a legal sex worker in Nevada might have that fact used against them in a child custody case because now there's a record of it. So legalization and regulation is something that sounds really appealing to legislators, and it sounds really appealing to people that have no lived experience because it feels like a way to provide worker protections or to manage worker safety. STD tests, clients, it's a place where you can do rules. Something that I like to say to organizers on this issue is sex work is work, but it is also sex. So when you talk about workplace regulations, or if you think about regulating sex work through the framework of labor rights first, you fall into the trap of these onerous regulations that are more often than not coming from a whorephobic place and often end up having a detrimental effect on sex workers and their ability to self-advocate, forcing them into exploitative situations that now have the benefit of being backed up by the power of the state. So now you're no longer talking about an exploitative third party. Well, we can get into that in a second. But I think that the way to frame sex worker rights is better served and is going to get to a better legislative place if we think of it through the LGBT umbrella and thinking about it as sexual expression, and that having sexual encounters between two consensual adults is simply not a crime, whether money is exchanged or not, which takes me to decriminalization, which is the model that the majority of sex worker advocates all over the world are advocating for. And it was the legal model that was implemented in New Zealand in 2003 with incredible results. Deregulation stops the arrests. It means that if you are engaging in an act of prostitution as an individual with another consenting adult, you are not committing a crime. Decriminalizing prostitution doesn't decriminalize rape. It doesn't decriminalize kidnapping. It doesn't decriminalize pedophilia. And it certainly doesn't decriminalize acts of violence. It simply separates those things and empowers voluntary consensual sex workers to report the crimes that are committed against them without fearing arrest themselves, whether they're licensed or not, right? Whether they got their mandatory STD test, or they work for a licensed brothel, or they're in the right zone, or like all of the other 1,001 ways that we can sort of regulate and limit and try to control sex work. So just to review, there are 4 ways to police prostitution. You can criminalize all of it. You can, but in practice, really, you're criminalizing the provider. You can criminalize the client and third parties. You can legalize it or regulate it, or you can decriminalize it. And I'm advocating for the decriminalization of prostitution, which you can tell because that's the title of the organization that I work for, but also it's the best policy. Before I move on to the history of policing prostitution, do you feel like those 4 paradigms are clear, or do you guys have follow-up questions about that section or things that you would like to dig into a little bit more?
Allie, do you want to?
Personally, I think that was great.
Oh, sweet. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, then let's move on.
That was actually, as a quick commentary. Oh, okay. I was going to say, that was a fascinating way of framing it as a question of not necessarily labor rights, which is something that always actually was a hang up for me, but as an act of sex first,
Sure.
which so now like the whole decriminalization makes a lot more sense.
Right.
So,
yeah, I think like if you come at trying to legalize prostitution from a labor rights perspective, I completely understand why people want to think in terms of workplace protections. It's just that we have to understand how those ideas are applied in practice in a whorephobic world and in a whorephobic culture, right? If we were not living in a whorephobic culture, then common sense regulations make sense to me, right? We want to, OSHA. I like OSHA. But we don't live in a world where the kinds of laws that would be applied to sex work would be for the benefit of workers. And we've seen the ways that this is implemented in Amsterdam and in Nevada. It becomes kind of a boys' club of brothel owners, and those are the real winners of a tightly legalized or regulated system. It's the ownership class that wins.
is there anywhere that has like a legalization framework, but without as much regulation involved, or do they all tend to just?
So I think New Zealand did a really, really good job of. So New Zealand, with the Prostitute Reform Act in 2003, completely decriminalized adult consensual prostitution. If you are a sole proprietor, if you're an individual and you're engaging in sex work for the first time or the 100th time, you are not committing a crime. But if there are more than 4 sex workers working together, they have to apply for a business license, which makes sense to me. And I think that we see this with other kinds of scale, right? Like if you have a lemonade stand, you don't have to apply for a business license. If you are starting a lemonade company, or if you have employees, then now you have workplace protections. So if you have more than 4 people working together in New Zealand, all of the rules that apply to any small business in New Zealand also apply to brothels and sex work cooperatives, right? You have to provide health insurance, they have health insurance in New Zealand because they're awesome. But you have to, there are rules, right, about how you treat employees that also apply to sex work. But I think what's different is that there are not a lot of unique laws that only apply to sex workers, with the exception, and this is something that was really great about the PRA in New Zealand, is the way that they treated STDs and sexual protection. In New Zealand, it is not a crime to engage in sex work without a condom, but you can be fined up to $2,000. So the fact that it's not criminal, right, means that sex workers do not fear arrest. But because there's a fine associated with it, it actually empowers sex workers to advocate for their own health and safety, right? So if a client says, can I bareback you? Then, the sex worker can be like, sure, but that's going to be an extra $2,000. So it empowers sex workers to advocate for themselves without adding a threat that often disempowers them. Because when you criminalize an activity, people that participate in that activity can no longer access the formal justice system of the state, right? Good talk. So yes, please.
I have a little question about, so I was listening to parts of your podcast and talking about back in the old days when sex workers would work together to protect their own. Is that even needed in New Zealand? Does collective power take a different form?
Totally.
Are there models of like unionization and even a co-op type deal? Just curious about that.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of different, so first of all, I think it's important to say that sex work has always been all kinds of people doing all kinds of things, right? Sex work is a really big umbrella that includes like legal porn performers and strippers, criminalized, prostitution, sort of legal gray areas like, DOMs or foot fetish workers. Like sex work is just like a really broad category that includes all kinds of people and all kinds of activities. So unionization tends to work best in legal atmospheres where there's a structure. So like strip clubs are a really great example of where we've seen examples of unionizing here in the US. There's actually a stripper strike happening right now across the United States to advocate for racial justice in strip clubs, because there's some like really explicit racism that happens and like who gets the best shifts and who is hired. There are actually signs on strip clubs that are like, we're not hiring Black strippers right now. I feel like sex work is often a place in society where things that are implied in mainstream culture become explicit in sex work. So strip clubs, where you have like a physical brick and mortar place where people are gathering, where you have a clear sort of like management, employer, and employee or independent contractor, because laws in this country, where people can gather together and advocate for higher wages or better working conditions together in the specific place that they're at, that makes a lot of sense. In New Zealand, what you'll see a lot of different models. You have some sex workers who work collectively, where they share resources like an in-call location that is shared between people, where you pool resources to do advertising, or where you'll use each other as a safety check, or pool resources to create some sort of safety net, right? Where 4 people are paying a security guard instead of 1 person. So you see that a lot, but you also see more traditional employees that, build a brothel and employ sex workers, because not everyone is an entrepreneur. Some people want to show up to work, they want to do their shift, and they want to go home. They don't want to do the 24-hour rigmarole of trying to promote yourself, trying to schedule and screen clients, or doing the 1,001 tasks that come with being an independent contractor. So because sex work is so many different things to so many different kinds of people, you see so many different kinds of business models that arise in different contexts. But what we see across the board is that criminalization of any kind disempowers workers. Great. So let's talk about the history of prostitution in the United States. So I say on the podcast and all the time, what's the oldest profession? It's in prostitution. Well, you're wrong. It's hunting, actually. But it's trading sex for material needs predates us as a species, right? Penguins do this, monkeys do this. There are actually several species of birds that engage in this activity. But when you're talking about prostitution proper, it's kind of impossible to think about that outside of a wage system, outside of a capitalist system. And so like you see examples of, indigenous temple like priestesses that are engaging in sort of sacred sex in indigenous cultures. Tlazolteotl is the goddess of sort of like redemptive filth and sex, where she is like a life goddess, and she was worshipped in the Aztec sort of temple of women. But it's really white colonists that sort of impose ideas of sexual shame and also wages and like working for money, and you need both of those things. We can talk about the shame thing, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to put it over there. But you really need wages and currency and money and exchange and industrialization when you talk about like modern conceptions of prostitution, right? So for example, early colonialists or, small towns like Iceland, I think is an example of this. When you have just a few people, everyone is doing everything. So there might be people within tiny like communities that do occasionally exchange sex for the resources that they need, but they're not identifying themselves as prostitutes or sex workers, because like everyone's a butcher, everyone's a seamstress, and then people are just doing what they need to do to survive. So let's fast forward to sort of an industrial, let's start with the Civil War. So the first example that we have of trying to regulate or trying to control the prostitution that happens in different places in the country and different contexts is during the Civil War. So Nashville, Tennessee, sex work and soldiers go together like peanut butter and jelly since before that was a sandwich, because when soldiers are in a community, they're often creating an economic disruption, right? So they're creating a lot of circumstance where people that might not otherwise engage in sex work have to engage in sex work in order to get their survival needs met. And then also soldiers are a concentrated group of men without their families that have access to money. So it's a sort of a double whammy in terms of the supply and demand dynamics that theaters of war create. And Nashville was no exception to that. It was just absolutely rife with brothels that were operating completely openly because there are no laws against it. A lot of these brothels are owned by men, but many of them are owned by women, and they are certainly run by women. And we'll get to that in a second. We're talking about the sisterhood of the brothel culture before. But a general who was sort of dim-witted at the time recognized that STDs were a real problem with his soldiers. The Union general who was occupying the Nashville at the time. And so he decides to get rid of all of the white prostitutes in Nashville. He decides to get rid of all of the white prostitutes in Nashville because, really saying more about his sexual preferences than anyone else's, he doesn't think that that Black prostitutes are going to be tempting enough for his soldiers. So he gets all of the prostitutes that he can identify on a boat called the USS Idaho, which I think is funny. Idaho, doesn't matter. So he puts them all on a boat and he tries to send them away, right? Like, okay, we took care of it. We got 30 hoes on a boat. We got this. Sends them away. And for a whole summer, they just float up and down the Mississippi River. Maybe it's the Ohio River. Geography is not my strong suit. One of the rivers, going up and down to various ports, getting turned away by various cities, and also throwing a fucking fit. They just take over this boat, and it's essentially mutiny of these exiled sex workers, and they come all the way back to Nashville, where this general is sort of now faced with like, oh, I thought I solved this problem. But not only has the problem not gone away in these women's absence, but here is this boat that is now still my problem. So he is the person that comes up with the idea of registering sex workers and issuing them health check cards. But these are health check cards of 1862. So there's no like real science that's happening, right? It's just some chauvinistic doctor like looking at your pussy being like, ooh, slutty. Like that's the whole thing. But this is an example of like how concepts of regulation, and specifically around STDs or thinking of sex workers as being vectors of disease, is used to the benefit of not sex workers, right? They don't care about whether or not they are suffering from disease, but rather to protect soldiers, to protect the military and merchant classes, and to create regulatory structures to control otherwise uncontrollable women. Because this is a dynamic that you see before the Civil War, and I'm sure it will go on after my death. Sex workers, unlike, I'm trying to get away from like, I used to say civilian women, but like in comedy, you also talk about civilians, and it's like just not a good framework. But like women that are still protecting their chastity in a society that values that the most do not have the same kind of freedom of movement and freedom of expression that women who engage in sex work do, right? Because they have no virginity to protect, they have no chastity to protect, which means they're able to enter into male spaces in a way that other women can't. I go into that more in the podcast, but there's a really, really long history of that, especially in Europe, of sex workers being sort of a special class of women that have access to libraries and positions of, all right, I digress. So the USS Idaho and the legalization and registration of sex work is the first example that we see of trying to regulate prostitution. You don't see a lot of regulatory efforts. I mean, like, women are picked up for vagrancy or public indecency. They're policed for being mouthy, essentially, but they're not policed for prostitution specifically. And brothels operate openly in every major city on the East Coast, in the South, in Charleston, and on the Western frontier. Sex workers actually become some of the largest landowners in new occupied territory. So Wyoming, for example, is the first state to give women the right to vote. Why? Was it because they were less sexist? Definitely not. It's because brothel owners were literally the largest fucking landowners. And so if you were going to deprive them of political agency, people with money get power. That's how that works. And so when you talk about the Western frontier, you see a lot of examples of women who are able to open up brothels. You see a lot more like women-owned brothels in the Western states, all the way to San Francisco and Seattle, which are both cities that are literally built by sex workers, right? The woman that started the public education system in Seattle was a notorious madam. Both Chinatown and the Red Light District are both sort of started and created by this fantastic sex worker who immigrates here from China before San Francisco becomes a city. Atoy in the, I don't want to fuck this up, I want to like 1830s, it'd be 1850s or 1880s. I don't have notes. Atoy is fantastic. And she's a really good example, and I'm going to use her life to sort of talk about the way that the criminalization of sex work happens in this country. But before I delve into that, I want to give you one example from New York, just because I think that she's somebody who should be celebrated in history. Mary Jones, who was born Peter C. Wally and became in the press known as Beefsteak Pete, was a Black trans sex worker that was working in New York in 1835, right? That's 25 years before the Civil War. She was working in a brothel as a cook during the day, and then was turning tricks as Mary Jones at night. In addition to that, she was also stealing wallets. So her clients complained to the police, not because prostitution was illegal and not because buggery was illegal, right? Prostitution was definitely totally fine, but buggery, or like butt sex, was aggressively criminalized in New York during this period of time. But instead, she got in trouble for stealing wallets. So a police officer goes undercover, pretends to be one of her clients, goes up and finds all of these wallets, takes her into court, and during that process discovers that they're dealing with a trans woman. And Mary Jones shows up in court in 1835 as Mary Jones, as herself, pleads guilty to wallet thievery, serves her time, 8 years, comes out and goes right back to the perfectly legal, openly operating brothel that she had made her home. And so like that's an example of prostitution not being specifically criminalized. On the other side of the country, Atoy immigrates to this country. She's one of the first Chinese women to arrive in San Francisco, and sort of leverages the racism and its accompanying fetishes. Allie, help me out. Fetishization.
Fetishization. I had it, and then I said
right.
it.
No, I'm sorry, I messed you up. But so she markets herself, right, as this exotic woman. She has bound feet, which is something that is new here in the U.S. And she becomes one of the most successful sex workers in San Francisco and a darling of the press because she actually uses the U.S. court system to advocate for herself in court. She takes clients to court when they try to pay her in fool's gold instead of in real gold. She doesn't win any of those cases, but she does win public accolades. Like the press is very much on her side when she drags these like dumb dudes into court and is like, this isn't real gold. She also goes head to head with the Chinese tongs, or the Chinese gangs at the time, who are trying to wrest control from her of her own business and become sort of a madam in her own right, and a businesswoman in her own right. However, anti-Chinese sentiment into the the Page Act of 1875. So anti-Chinese sentiment in this country boils over. And in San Francisco, you see vigilante groups and this sort of strange combination that we'll get into later of women prohibitionists, women who will later identify as feminists, right? But these are like prohibitionists, essentially, people who are fighting for the prohibition of alcohol, people who are fighting moral crusades. These are white middle-class women who are trying to eradicate vice and clean up our cities, partner with virulently racist people who are also trying to clean up our cities from immigrants and people of color. And so they start cracking down on Chinese-owned brothels, and this later expands to all brothels. So now let's talk about the legal situation. Every city is different, but the rumblings of we have to crack down on vice start almost immediately after the Civil War. So 1875 to, let's call it like 1900 or 1910, you start to see different cities pop up with different regulations that try to suppress vice. And it's done very much in this moralizing crusade, and it's very much a reaction to the emancipation of Black people in the South, and also a wave of immigration, and is applied, as I'm sure it'll be no shock to anyone, in a super racist way, where we're really looking for reasons to crack down on communities of color. And so the prohibition of alcohol, the prohibition of prostitution, the criminalization of abortion, all of that happens around the same time in the lead up to the progressive era. But the first federal anti-prostitution law is also our first federal anti-immigration law, the Page Act of 1875, which specifically bars Chinese women from immigrating for immoral purposes. This, of course, becomes an outright ban on all unmarried Chinese or women of Asian descent who are immigrating here to the US. And it's very disruptive. This, of course, manifests later into the much more explicitly titled or Chinese Exclusion Act just a few years later. So you can sort of see that progression. On a federal level, and happening sort of at the same time, is this construction of the white slave narrative. So in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and you can see this with the propaganda of the time, people are terrified of Black men, essentially, or unrest, and this idea that like animalistic Black men are going to be roving the streets, unable to control their desires now that they are not literally shackled, are raping and kidnapping white women. And you get this construction, they literally call it white slavery. You see this trope in Birth of a Nation. I assume that you haven't seen it, but it's impossible to overstate the cultural impact of this film. It was screened at the White House, and it rewrote the narrative of the Confederacy. It's the Birth of a Nation and its twin, Gone with the Wind, that essentially resurrect this idea of like a lost cause or a more genteel time that was somehow sullied or polluted by the eradication of slavery. And so this is where you get the idea that that white supremacy is actually chivalry, and what this violent police force is doing isn't terrorizing minority communities. No, we're protecting our women. We're protecting our white women from these dangerous dangerous underclass. And you see this in the propaganda at the time, where you see sort of white faces behind bars. And there are all of these groups. Many of them are tied to the alcohol prohibitionist groups and sort of like the Christian extremists and racist groups sort of all get together and agree on this cultural narrative of what prostitution is, right? Which is white women being victimized by Black and brown men. And this idea of miscegenation or interracial intercourse being equivalent or equated to rape, right? You see this in Birth of a Nation. You see this in a lot of tropes at the time of like, there is no space for consensual relationships between white women and Black men. If that is happening at all, it is always rape. But there's also no conception of rape being done by white powerful people. It's like we rewrite what consent is to fit into this racial structure. So you get so this all manifests, right? So it's this sort of like bubbling up of like different communities, and the press are panicking, and there's stories after story in the white slave law of 1910, which is also known as the Mann Act. And what this does is it criminalizes transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, right? So this is framed as an anti-trafficking law, and it's framed as an anti-white slave law, but in practice, it's used to arrest chorus girls for doing their job, crack down on people who are in extramarital affairs, but most especially and most virulent. There's a V word, that's the word that I want it to be.
Virulently? I think you're right, virulently.
Most aggressive, most virulently used to police interracial relations, right? And specifically criminalizing, and it doesn't, we don't rescue many sex slaves. And none of the anti-trafficking laws that we've passed have resulted in us rescuing any sex slaves. That's not a thing. There are not many sex slaves. There are too many volunteers. There are too many people that just need money and are willing to do sex for that. So let's fast forward. So 1910 is when you see the white slave law. And this is also when you start to see anti-vice and prohibition, the prohibition of alcohol and the prohibition of prostitution really happen at the same time, not least of which because many, many saloons doubled as brothels. There was actually a law in Charleston where men were not allowed to own bars. They had to be owned by women. And so what would happen is like a husband and wife team would buy a place, and the man would run the bar downstairs but the property was in the woman's name, and she would run the brothel upstairs. So this cracking down on vice with both the prohibition of alcohol and the prohibition of prostitution happens sort of simultaneously. And it leads to one of the first protests by sex workers in this country, which happens January 25th of 1917, as the red light district or the brothels are being evicted in San Francisco. They were deemed criminal in 1913, but nobody moved on that law until Valentine's Day of 1917. And so just a few weeks before that, 300 sex workers marched on the minister, the like leading crusader against vice's home, and asked him a pretty basic question, which is, where do you expect us to go? So that happened in San Francisco in 1917. The 1920s, you see a speakeasy culture, and the American theater of World War I and World War II is where a very like an anti-STD and kind of a very explicitly like anti-woman propaganda campaign equating loose women to as infection, like I wish I'd pulled up my presentation, but like these sort of like anti-VD posters are just an obsession during World War I and World War II. And so you see a crackdown on prostitution, and it's pushed as a military campaign, as a way to save our soldiers from the pestilence and these infectious women, right? We infect cities, we infect people. And so it creates this crackdown that results in something called the American Plan. In Great Britain, it was called the Contagious Diseases Acts, but essentially military bases empower local police to round up loose women, subject them to STD tests at the time, and if they're found to be infectious, then they're put in lock hospitals. But again, this is 1917, so like the science is a little iffy, the doctors are chauvinistic, incredibly racist, And essentially, any woman walking alone, eating alone, or making the wrong kind of eye contact with a cop, if she's in the wrong place at the wrong time, any police officer has the right to arrest any woman on the grounds of promiscuity in order to save soldiers from STDs. This is the legal basis of what becomes the eugenics program in the US. So we start treating these women with like arsenic and mercury and other super helpful stuff, and we eventually lead to sterilizing this women. This is a war on women. Many scholars have framed it as a reaction to the suffrage movement, right? As like white middle class women gain more political power and are pushing more into the public sphere, there's this reactionary crackdown on less powerful women. So it's sort of an interesting juxtaposition that, 1917, it's 3 years before suffrage in the US, right? And women in California have had the right to vote for longer. They I want to say 1915, but I could be wrong about that. But Western states often get the right to vote for women before the East Coast. 3 years before national suffrage for women, you see sex workers who are marching for their rights and advocating for themselves as they're watching the brothels close and as you're watching literally the criminalization of public women in the name of cracking down on STDs. So I think it's important to understand the war years. Wars are also sort of an interesting time for the status of women because like as the mobilization of like massive numbers of men go overseas to fight, it sort of opens up more economic opportunities here for women. So during the theater of both World War I and World War II, you see a lot of middle-class women who are entering the workforce for the first time, and you see a lot of other economic opportunities. And then after World War II, as a reaction to that, you see what Betty Friedman, of course, calls the problem that has no name, sort of the commercialization, essentially putting women back in the home. And there's like a massive propaganda campaign. Like the women of the 1930s and 40s are able to women of the 1920s and 30s are able to like get jobs, right? You see movies of like female journalists or, Katharine Hepburn, I think is an example of like, she's a woman who flies. By the time you get to the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, these things are now unheard of. So even though women have the right to vote, we have some other political power, the cultural reality for women is rapidly changing. And a lot of that has to do with the criminalization, again, of like being in public spaces. So this is where this is the era where Betty Page is arrested for participating in her, what I think anyone on this call would call a very tame photo shoot of her in a bikini. You see a massive sort of anti-pornography campaign that starts, actually, let's put a pin in that in 1950, right? Let's go back a couple of steps and talk about anti-pornography laws and their impact. Anthony Comstock is the person who writes our first national obscenity laws and makes it a federal crime to mail obscene material through the US mail. He defines obscene material as, pornography, of course, but also information about women's bodies and birth control. And he is almost single-handedly responsible for delaying the birth control movement in this country by decades. He first goes after Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president. She was also known as a sex worker. And he literally puts her in jail. And he also tries to put Margaret Sanger 50 years later in jail for passing out information about birth control. So we see the equating of pornographic material with medically accurate information about sex, or like this idea that like information about birth control or information about women's bodies is pornographic, right? This baseline obscenity of just like the female body or any expression at all of sexuality. In fact, Margaret Sanger tried to publish a piece very famously where she said like everything that a girl ought to know about sex, and Comstock had it censored and wrote in big bold letters, nothing. underneath it. And so he criminalizes information about birth control in the name of cracking down on pornography, which is why by the time you get to the 1970s, and the feminist movement and the porn wars is so interesting, because you have women like Gloria Steinem who are advocating for the criminalization of pornography because they believe that it objectifies and victimizes women, very much buying into this sort of like white slave idea, partnering with folks like the Christian Coalition who believe that like information about birth control is obscene. And so they get together and create a political force to try to criminalize pornography, pitting sort of mainstream or will become known as carceral feminists against sex workers, of course, many of whom self-identify as working women and as feminists themselves. Do we want to take? No, we don't have to. We can just keep moving forward. So the AIDS epidemic hits in the late 70s, 1980s, and it is literally a death knell for a lot of sex worker activism, and of course the gay community. The Stonewall riots, which we'll get to in 1969, the LGBT community and the sex worker rights community have always gone together and have always shared spaces. In fact, it's widely believed that the first stones that were thrown at Stonewall in 1969 to start the gay rights movement were actually hurled by a trans sex worker of color. Monica Jones and Sylvia Riviera were eminent organizers within the gay rights movement and queer liberation of the 1960s. They start the STAR, which is Street Trans Action Network, and they're literally doing sex work in order to meet the survival needs of their community, engaging in mutual aid, which is something that like sex work communities, LGBT communities, artistic communities, fringe communities that exist outside of the mainstream have been participating in for generations. But HIV/AIDS creates a unique set of circumstances. It provides more ammunition to governments that are trying to criminalize sex, right? So it creates a new impetus for those kinds of regulatory efforts. And also it's used, and also it kills off literally a lot of organizers. We lose a generation of people who are advocating for sexual liberation. But HIV/AIDS also provides the groundwork that sex worker rights advocates are able to leverage in order to get recognition from the state. And you see that in San Francisco. So and also in New Zealand. So the St. James Infirmary is the longest standing, oldest by and for sex worker clinic in the country. And it was funded by the city of San Francisco as an effort and part of trying to crack down on the AIDS epidemic. And that happens in 1992. They get funding for that. And so it's interesting that modern activists are using sort of like public health crises in order to advocate for getting the needs of their community met and funded, while it also creates this sort of like threat and demand to crack down or further criminalize that community. So that sort of paradigm and paradox exists. One of the coolest sex worker rights advocates in this country, or most well known, is Margot St. James, who the infirmary is named after. She got started in the 1970s, again in San Francisco. San Francisco is just a hotbed of like sex worker rights advocacy. They're just the best, from Atoy all the way to Coyote. She started WHO, which was called Whores, Housewives, and Others. Others meant lesbian at the time, but nobody was saying that out loud because that's how deep that stigma goes. But she was trying to unify women. She was not getting any traction in the mainstream feminist movement. She was butting heads with people like Gloria Steinem that were trying to impose ideas of like false consciousness or like, you're a victim, you just don't know it yet. And she started Coyote, which stands for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. She founded that organization in 1973. There's a lot of information about her. She's pretty amazing. And she sued the state of Rhode Island for sex discrimination because both buying and selling sex was a crime, but only sellers who were overwhelmingly women were being arrested in Rhode Island. So she sued the state in the 1970s, and the court agreed with her. And they asked the legislature to fix the sexism of their law, and they never did that. They never got around to doing that. So in 2003, an attorney who I've actually had the pleasure of meeting and who is a pretty cool guy, he was not a criminal attorney, which is why he went in to like look up the statute, as he had a couple of clients who were arrested for running brothels and engaging in prostitution and massage parlors in Rhode Island. And he found that there just was no criminal statute. And so he went to the judge and was like, you have to dismiss this case because this isn't a crime. And that got a bit of press coverage. And so indoor prostitution was effectively decriminalized in Rhode Island between 2003 and 2009, when the legislature recriminalized it in order to crack down on trafficking. So that brings me to today, where we have a lot of efforts across the country to crack down on trafficking. And something really gross is happening. Labor trafficking in this country is a huge issue. And I think anyone that works with the DSA understands that, like, labor exploitation, wage theft, terrible working conditions are a reality that are faced by an uncomfortably large chunk of our workforce in agriculture, in domestic labor, in a lot of different labor sectors. But rather than cracking down on exploitative working conditions, anti-trafficking movements try to conflate adult consensual prostitution with the crime of sex trafficking. And so they erase labor trafficking in other sectors in order to criminalize prostitution and crack down on adults who are engaging in consensual sex with each other. And they call that a rescue mission. We see this in raids, something called Operation Cross Country, where the FBI partners with local law enforcement every summer, where they LARP essentially as both clients and providers online, trying to entrap people in engaging in acts of prostitution. Massive militarized stings on immigrant-owned businesses. I think the Robert Kraft sting in Florida that just happened, was it a year ago? A year ago is a really good example of this. And the only unusual fact in that case was that somebody as high profile as Robert Kraft was involved. For those of you that don't know, because I definitely didn't, he owns a really big sport ball team. He's like a billionaire from somewhere. He has in Florida and also Massachusetts, but he went to a massage parlor that advertised itself as giving happy endings. And he paid, he was a 70-year-old widower, and he paid a 45-year-old woman to massage a more intimate part of his body. But without him knowing, 4 law enforcement agencies, including Homeland Security, had actually installed hidden cameras in the massage rooms. They told the owners of the massage parlor that there was a bomb threat, and so they cooperated with law enforcement while they went in and installed these hidden cameras. And they did a surveillance on multiple massage parlors for months, right? With like police officers recording, like, I don't know, the world's most boring porn. But like the massive amount of law enforcement resources went into publicly humiliating these men, arresting 19 women, charging them with multiple felonies, deporting 1 woman. And all of this was presented to the press as a rescue operation, that law enforcement was rescuing women from sexual slavery, which, now that we've gone over the history of that, I hope that you can see the through lines from the white slave propaganda and the war on women and the post-war years and the way that this actually manifests. On April 11th of 2018, Donald Trump signed SESTA FOSTA into law. This is another anti-trafficking federal bill that was ostensibly designed to crack down on child sex slavery, but instead what it did was erased the places on the internet where adult sex workers had been using them to schedule and screen their clients. So it erased Craigslist erotic services, Backpage, Rentboy, one after another. Platforms that sex workers were using to keep themselves safe disappeared. There's another bill that's making its way through Congress that is even worse. It's going after end-to-end encryption called the Earn It Act. And this is another example of the government using the rhetoric of sex slavery in order to make a massive power grab. And I feel like anyone who is dumb enough in Trump's America to trust that the government is actually trying to protect people instead of using this as a gross abuse of power, well, we just see the world really differently. So that takes us up to today. I'm happy to go on and on and on about the different sex worker rights groups that exist, the tactics that they're using across the country, what kind of legislative initiatives are happening. DSW has active campaigns in Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York. I think that's it for now, or that's all we're allowed to talk about publicly. Sex workers are standing up across the country. SESTA FOSTA was a real galvanizing moment for us. We saw some of the biggest demonstrations since 1917, really advocating to listen to sex workers and stop the arrests and to think about policing prostitution differently. I've been engaged in those fights since 2016, and I'm thrilled to see a lot of that rhetoric in the defund the police ask. And I think when you talk about the difference between adult consensual sex work and human trafficking, the asks of defunding the police and investing in our communities are a through line, right? We said in the beginning of this talk that like universal health insurance is an anti-trafficking initiative. Why? Because desperate people do desperate things. And the number one cause of bankruptcy in this country and homelessness, in fact, is healthcare costs. And so if you remove healthcare costs from people, then you free them essentially to not have to engage in work that they don't want to do to survive. Something that I say to people all the time is that if you have a problem with people doing things that they otherwise wouldn't do for money, you don't have a problem with prostitution, you have a problem with capitalism. And we should talk about that. And I think that the way that we police prostitution and the way that we conceive of prostitution is essentially a way for us to project our very real discomfort with the exploitative system that we've created with capitalism, with the carceral state, onto this very narrow and poorly defined, criminalized sort of like shadow of an idea. And so sex workers, we've always, I think, been symbols for society's big fears. And this conflation of trafficking with adult consensual sex work is a problem because we are arresting people instead of helping them. But we know that handcuffs don't help. And so if you want to help trafficking victims, you have to stop arresting adult consensual sex workers, and you have to start investing in the survival needs of everyone. And that concludes my talk on this.
I love it. Michael, do you want me to jump in with a few questions now, or should we open it up?
Yeah, so let's, well, we'll have you ask a few questions, and while Ali is asking questions, anyone in the audience, feel free to input your questions into the chat, and we'll have Kaytlin answer them.
All right, so I wrote these in advance. So some of them you already mentioned. I'm glad that you mentioned the Earn It Act, which I barely paid attention to until recently. So
I think it's complicated. It's complicated for a reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's both very simple and also unclear. But do you want me to I guess I should let you get your question out.
Yeah, well, I can't take credit for this question. My girlfriend wanted me to pose it. So what are your thoughts on this particular piece of legislation, and how will the passage of this impact the most attacked and least protected populations, such as Black, Latinx, or Indigenous LGBTQIA+ folk?
Great question. So for the folks that don't know, the Earn It Act stands for eliminating something child pornography. So like it's being presented as this anti-child sexual exploitation law, which I think is a fallacy, because child molestation predates the internet, for example, and like cracking down on like images of child pornography is not the same as cracking down on child sexual exploitation. And of course we know, and advocates know, that the overwhelming majority of child exploitation happens within the home and happens within community. It's not stranger danger, right? It's not this white slave false narrative of somebody from some other community coming into yours to kidnap children, right? It's probably your uncle. But anyway, the Earn It Act claims to be erasing child pornography from the internet, but what they're aiming for is end-to-end encryption. So essentially, sort of like with the Comstock law back in 1873 that made it a crime to mail obscene material, this empowers the government to open your mail. This empowers the government to open your private communication and look in to make sure that there's not child pornography. But of course, this is Donald Trump's America. This is a carceral state. If the government has the ability to look, they're not just going to stop with child pornography. They're going to be looking for all kinds of crimes, including organizing protests, right? We have people who are being charged with federal crimes right now for graffitiing Confederate monuments. We have people who are engaged in active resistance who are being characterized by the federal government as criminals. And so when end-to-end encryption is a way that activists have been protecting themselves and protecting their communication, if that goes away, that goes away. It's also a way for therapists and their clients to protect private communication. There's some communication that just has to stay private, like between a lawyer and a client. We're all living in a Zoom world right now with the coronavirus, so people are not meeting in person. So how can you protect privileged information if you create a backdoor entrance for the government / any hacker that knows their shit? And of course, this impacts sex workers and their clients who are using end-to-end encryption to try to protect their communication. This is a problem for sex workers. This is a problem for organizers. This is a problem for journalists who are trying to protect their sources. And it should be a problem for anybody that values privacy or freedom of expression in this country. They've already tried to erase, they've already tried to get around the First Amendment by making third-party platforms responsible for what people post publicly. This is the next step of going after private communication. And they say that they're going after porn, but they're actually going after your privacy. There was a question I saw. Let's see.
Yes. I don't know if you can read it.
Yes, so this is actually a really great point. Pornography in the 1970s is run by the mob, but so is Stonewall, right? So like literally gay bars in 1970s New York are run by the mafia, not because gay men have a thing for Italians, which I would totally get, but because when you criminalize something, when you push it underground, you end up pushing that in the hands of organized crime. So it makes sense to me that pornography and prostitution are going to be run by organized crime because it's criminalized. So yes. So this question, I'm going to read the whole thing because I only responded. So Steinem and other feminists oppose pornography and prostitution because these enterprises were largely male-owned and exploited women. Legalizing it would help alleviate that exploitation, but you pointed out the Netherlands and other nations have legalized these industries, still have issues with exploitation. What's the solution? I think the solution is to decriminalize adult consensual prostitution. That's not the same as decriminalizing pornography. I think pornography, very similar to strip clubs, is it's a work environment where regulation makes more sense. I would say that like pornography should probably be subjected to the same kind of regulations that the rest of the film industry is engaged in. But I think that with there are a lot of unintended consequences with regulatory efforts that are coming from a good place. Like, for example, when California passed their mandatory condom law, they ended up pushing huge swaths of the pornography industry underground. A lot of it moved to Florida, and a lot of it became amateur, which ended up creating sort of like all of these other unintended consequences. I would want to bring somebody in who is more familiar with the ins and outs of like pornography legislation, because I've focused the majority of my career on prostitution specifically. So I know that there are unintended consequences. I just don't know specifically what those are and can't speak with as much authority on them as I can prostitution specifically. But Gloria Steinem, I actually asked her at the 90 Second Why recently, and you can look it up on YouTube. I asked her when she would be willing to listen to sex workers and stop the arrests. And she pointed to the arrests of clients as the feminist solution. And when I pointed out that this had a negative and detrimental impact on sex workers and resulted in things like Operation Homeless in the Netherlands, she dismissed me. So Gloria Steinem has done a lot of incredible work, but I think that she's wrong about this issue.
Kind of as a side point to that, is that part of like the overfocus of sex work as a female profession?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything in it. I imagine that the female side of sex work is a lot larger than the male side.
It's hard to count a criminalized class. I think that you're in safer territory talking about buyers. I think that there's definitely a lot of evidence to suggest that more men buy sex than women. But there are providers of all genders that are well represented in sex work, even if they're not policed in the same way. I would also say that in countries where you see more income equality, where women have actually achieved the economic status of men, you see a lot more women buying sex. But yeah, it's absolutely, the gender binary is a false construct, and that's never been true of sex work. So there's another great question here from Mary asking about what some alternatives are to calling the police that sex workers have used. So I can speak to my own experience in 2004 and 2005 in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where I was working at the time. There was a really robust mutual review system between clients and providers. And there was also a great blacklisting system. All of that was made possible before Sesta Fosta, and I haven't been active working since Sesta Fosta, but I know that communication between sex workers about clients, mutual aid, and I don't want to say, it's not really restorative justice, but more networks of providers sharing information about potential clients, and also safe spaces to go, safe doctors where they can report what happened to them, safe accountants, safe attorneys, sex work positive professionals. So it's a network of mutual review. Again, a lot of this is complicated because of its criminality. So there's a lot of harm reduction tools that are available online, but are secretive and are passed between providers. But what sex workers have found is that is safety in numbers and safety in community and chosen family. And much like the LGBT community, sex workers will find other people to work with and share resources in order to keep themselves safe. But there's a long, long history of mutual aid among sex workers, exactly for the reasons that I outlined of our inability to access more traditional forms of support, or those more traditional forms of support being corrupted by law enforcement. There's a lot of agencies and services out there that are only available to sex workers if they stop doing sex work. But none of those services actually provide enough to get the survival needs met of like an adult. So yeah.
I have some more questions.
Great.
To fill the time until other people speak up, but these are great questions so far. All right, so let's see. All right, what responsibilities and/or reflective questions would you like to impart on those who intend to be strong allies in the fight to protect the safety and well-being of sex workers, considering the age we find ourselves in technologically and culturally?
That's a great question. I feel like the answer is always to listen more. I think that listening to sex workers is the big ask that we have in all of our communities. We want legislators to listen to sex workers, and we want our communities to listen to sex workers. We have a lot of knowledge that we would love to share, but we can't do that if other people's narratives are being imposed on us. And I think that especially with sex work, as I've said many times in this talk, it's a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? There are people that have had negative, traumatic, exploitative experiences in sex work. There are people who have had transformative, empowering, spiritual awakening experiences in sex work, and everything in between. You cannot assume somebody's experience. And I think letting folks tell you what they need, which is one of the primary, like the foundations of mutual aid, right? Of like not imposing your idea of what a community member needs, but rather asking what folks need for them. But yeah, I would say listening to sex workers and trying to remind everyone that whether you can see us or not, we're a part of your community, and we've been a part of every community the whole time. But yeah, sorry.
Perfect.
Oh, sorry.
Mikey,
Do you mind? Yeah, sorry. I had this question pop up. In Rhode Island between 2003 and was it 2009?
Yeah, 6 years.
I remember seeing a study that domestic violence also went down.
Yeah,
is that
and rape and gonorrhea.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Is that true of places that generally have some
totally? So yeah, let me speak to that. So between 2003 and 2009, when indoor prostitution was both decriminalized in Rhode Island and also people knew that, right? Because like really it was decriminalized in 1979, but like nobody knew that and the arrest didn't stop. So 2003 to 2009, when that was happening, reported cases of rape went down 30%, and incidents of gonorrhea in women went down 40%. And this study was done by Scott Cunningham, but basically it demonstrates that when you remove the threat of arrest, when you remove the threat of criminality, you allow women to be, or sex workers to be, better self-advocates for their own sexual health. There's a fascinating study that was also done by Scott Cunningham about Craigslist erotic services ads. So before Sesta Fosta, Craigslist erotic services was something that Craigslist rolled out over a period of, I think it was 15 years in different cities at different times. And so researchers were able to do a cross analysis and sort of compare cities of similar size. You know, one had access to Craigslist erotic services and one didn't. And he found that on average, the female homicide rate was reduced by 17%. Now, this is a factor of several things. The ability to freely advertise sexual services and schedule and screen your clients online makes sex work safer, and a disproportionate amount of female homicides are sex worker victims. So when you make sex work safer, you reduce female victims. But also, sex work that's available where you can post an ad online freely, and again, schedule and screen your clients from the privacy of your own home, opens up sex work to victims of domestic violence that may need to flee an acutely violent situation, where they might not otherwise have access to that, right? Somebody who is like unwilling to participate in other forms of sex work might be willing to post up an ad in order to get the cash they need for a hotel room tonight, right? Like, so that those kinds of survival situations are enabled by services like Craigslist erotic services. Also, and this is sort of a controversial position, but it's a position that the Catholic Church took in the 13th century, having Craigslist erotic services or having access to sex work for like society tends to take the temperature down a notch on male violence, that there are men who are murderous that when they have access to sex workers are not murdering those sex workers, which is very bad and should be discouraged. And it would be very helpful if we could report suspicious activity to the police, for example, but are not murdering. This is another reason why the, not intersection, but this is another reason why you see sex workers and soldiers together in so many places. My father was a soldier. I grew up on military bases. The goddess Ishtar, right, who's the goddess of love and war, sends one of her harlots to Gilgamesh, one of the sort of like earliest warriors in Western civilization, for 7 days and 6 nights, not only to like teach him how to bathe and have table manners, but also like fucks the violence out of him so that he's able to sort of like enter into civilized society. So this is one of those like weird like things that you see, and I know that folks have a lot of feelings about it, but we do see over and over again where places that allow for sex work to exist have fewer incidents of domestic violence, and that's just a fact.
I want to jump in with a question that you definitely touched on so far, but I want to really nail down. All right, this is long-winded, and this comes from, you know, my professional roles. As noted previously, although many sex workers choose to enter into this field of work, the conversation that consistently comes up in these conversations and is also the supposed forefront of legislation is genuine concern for those who are trafficked or forced into survival sex, particularly children. In the past, I have found it difficult to walk the line between being mindful of the quote, big picture data while working with advocates who may be trying to honor these survivors' voices. For instance, 96% of sexually abused children are done so by a family member or family friend. In data from youth served in the greater Boston area from a nonprofit called My Life, My Choice, their data shows that approximately 85% of those sexually exploited children have been involved in the child welfare system, with 66% disproportionately represented as being Black and Indigenous people of color. What are the conversations that socialists in particular can have regarding these underlying concerns?
There's a lot there, right? This might be a controversial thing to say, but I would say that like the state is the biggest trafficker that there is. I think that's what the carceral system is. That's what you see in a lot of the institutions and foster care is, you know, folks who folks are in deeply exploitative, sexually exploitative situations. And I think that as a socialist, you have all picked up on the basic wisdom that people that have to work in order to get their survival needs met are already in an exploitative situation, whether they're selling sex or they're selling their labor in another capacity. And I think that this focus and emphasis on sexual labor ends up erasing a lot of the exploitation in other labor sectors, right? Coal mines, slaughterhouses. I could go on and on of jobs that I find more viscerally repulsive than sex work.
Even just, I want to jump in, the whole conversation about who and who isn't an essential worker at this point.
Yes. And so I feel like when you have the state compelling people to work, right, as they are now, by, you know, withholding resources and forcing essential workers in the front lines you're talking about a deeply exploitative situation that is erased if we pretend that the only trafficking that exists looks like sex work. And so I think that that is a conversation that I would love to see DSA engage in, is re-elevating other forms of labor exploitation to complicate the narrative around what trafficking looks like. Because right now we're falling into sort of like the white slavery trope. And just like the trope about white slavery did a lot to erase rape, right? Of like, especially rape done by white men or powerful men. And when we pretend that, you know, violent rape is only stranger danger of somebody of a different race than you, then it becomes harder and harder to report what sexual violence actually looks like. And so we're just now reckoning with that with the Me Too movement and talking about what sexual violence and exploitation looks like. And I think that we're doing a very similar thing with sex trafficking, in that we're pretending, we're letting a false narrative get in the way of being able to have the real conversations about what a human rights tragedy it is to be living in a country that doesn't provide healthcare, that doesn't guarantee housing, that doesn't provide people with the material, doesn't meet the material needs of its citizens, so that we can all make choices and have more active agency in our lives. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, it's 8:30. Do you have any wrap-up statements you'd like to give? This was a wonderful presentation, and you know, I feel like I can speak on behalf of the DSA and saying thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, thank you very much for inviting sex workers to the table. You know, I said earlier that the best thing to be done is to listen, and so again, thank you so much for inviting me here to listen and to include sex work as a part of our analysis. I know that we're all working towards a future where nobody has to work in order to get their survival needs met. And I know that there's a long history in socialist and communist circles of erasing sex work and working towards a future where nobody has to do this work, which I think is different from working towards a future where this work doesn't exist, you know? And so including adult consensual sex workers in the conversation, I think is really important. And so I applaud you for inviting me here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh no, it's our pleasure. And you know, like you were saying, it intersects with so many different places in terms of morality, in terms of sexuality, and how we police that in the society. So this was super informative. And again, thank you. For everyone else, thank you for showing up and listening and participating. Next week is the wrap up of our series. We're going to have Peter, I should have had his name up, Peter Van Konet. I probably pronounced that wrong. And he's from Minneapolis, and he's an activist there. And they're going to be discussing on the ground work for abolition of police in Minneapolis, and the stuff they've been doing there. Again, Kaytlin, thank you so much. Allie, great job. Thank you. And, you know, we're definitely hoping to bring these other voices to the table. So good night, everyone.